Okay, hello. Welcome to iTestimony. Today we are talking to John, and I'm going to let John have a few moments to just share with us anything he wants to share about himself.
Hello, I'm retired. I've been retired for 3 years. I enjoy a lot of outdoor activities. Um, Currently attend a church on a regular basis. I'm married, I have one son, and love being able to tell people about my faith.
Great. So, John, tell us a little bit about your life growing up and what your life was like in relation to faith. Were you taken to church by your parents? What was that like?
I I was an only child. I grew up being involved in church. My dad did not attend. He claimed that he was an atheist. That could very well be, or I don't know at the time if agnostics were even, if that was a term then, but he never attended, but my mother was a real strong Catholic. And so I was raised in the Catholic religion. First communion, catechism, all of the firsts that little Catholic kids go through, and then I was confirmed. I can't say that I had a real burning desire to ever go to church. I went because that was what I did, and that was what was expected of me from my mother, and that was about it. After I was confirmed, I attended for a while, still into high school, and then in college, pretty much just slipped away from any regular attendance. Never had a personal relationship with God, and attended periodically, going to the usual Catholic services, Christmas, Easter, funerals, baptisms, those kinds of things, but very, very non-committal.
Okay. Did you participate in things like confession or anything like that?
Oh yeah, that was a requirement growing up, and especially for confirmation. We had to do those kinds of things. The priest was. We were taught by a combination of priests and nuns. And it was a while back, and there were a lot of, I think at that time where I was living, there were a number of Catholic churches in this small town, and which is, kind of interesting. Now I believe there's only one. But yeah, I did all of those things, but like I said, I never really had a relationship with God.
Sure. And so then, did you go through a time in your life that you would say was kind of a period of rebellion then?
Yeah, oh yeah, for sure. When I was in college, did the usual college things, parties and what have you. I wasn't. Yeah, I did enough of that stuff. But yeah, I think more than anything, if I was rebellious towards God, it was that my life wasn't at all centered around God. It was centered around my family, my son, my work, and my activities. So those pretty much were my gods. And if you can be rebellious, if that's being rebellious, everything but the real God.
Okay. When you were in that period of your life, did you think about God, or did you have thoughts about?
You know, the only time I really thought about him was obviously when you go to church. But I didn't think about him on a regular basis. I had I had some health issues as when I was growing up, or actually it started when I was in my 30s, and had a number of different issues where I had to go in for extended stays in hospitals and surgeries and such, and I guess that was when I started praying. I didn't know what I was praying for. I was praying for health, and I didn't have very good health at the time. Of course, when when either you're sick or you're dying, that's when all of a sudden God's very important.
Yeah.
So I remember when I was in the hospital. I had a long hospital stay. Once I was able to walk around, I would go down to the chapel, and at that time I would pray the usual Catholic prayers, the Our Father and the Hail Mary and some of those, and I was just praying for better health. So I guess I guess I did believe in God, but I never really had a personal relationship. Yeah.
I want to revisit something you said earlier. You mentioned your father being perhaps atheist or agnostic. Did that affect your relationship with your father at all, or?
Not so much my relationship. My father was an alcoholic, and that had more of an impact on the family than anything.
Sure.
I know that that impacted my mother much more so than him not going to church.
Okay.
And I think that when we would go to church, he would stay home or whatever, and it was always that way. So I guess as I was growing up, and even when I was in going through confirmation class and some of those things, it just never occurred to me that this wasn't his thing. And at that time, I don't know if it was my thing, because you're going through
Sure.
certain steps, and in the Catholic religion, there are certain things you have to do, and you have to say, and you got to pray, and you got to kneel, and you got to go to confession. You have all those different things that you do, and I think that was more about. It wasn't until I became an adult and had health issues that I started actually thinking about God a little bit.
Okay, so you wouldn't necessarily say that his lack of belief necessarily influenced you.
Nah, I don't think that had any bearing on my faith or lack of faith.
Okay.
Him being an alcoholic had a big bearing on
Sure.
my behavior and what I thought about that. But those two, there wasn't a connection there.
Okay. So how did your salvation come about then?
Well, it's an interesting story. I was married. I'm remarried now, but I was married to this woman for almost 30 years, 29 and a half years, and she decided that she wanted to get a divorce. And it always takes two people to make or break a marriage, and I wasn't unfaithful or any of those things. I probably, more than anything, I was not interested, or I had more interest in work, my son, and my activities than my wife. So go figure that things just didn't work out. Well, so went through this divorce, and after about a year or so of being single, a friend of mine suggested that I date and see this woman that he knew, and she knew. This was a couple that I knew, and it was during my busy time at work, and I kind of just put it off. I said, I don't know, I'll think about it. And a couple months later, I did end up following through and called this woman, and I did know her from previous relationships. Actually, she had been a teacher of my son's, which was kind of interesting. But so we knew each other, but I didn't really know her that well. And as it turned out, she had gone through a similar situation, a similar kind of divorce, where she did not want the divorce, and her ex-husband did, and so she'd been divorced for a couple years, and started just casually seeing each other, and she suggested, somewhere maybe after a month or two into our getting to know each other, that I come to church with her. And she was a real regular churchgoer, went to an evangelical free church, and suggested that I come to one of their services. So I did that, and it was very interesting, to say the least, because being raised a Catholic, it was very different. Everything was different. Went to Sunday school, did the whole 9 yards, and it was just different. And after that, did go again, and I think a couple more times, and as it turns out, we were getting closer and closer in our relationship, and I think that. And I wasn't a believer then. At that time, she was a believer, been a believer for many, many years before that. And I think that had things not worked out the way they did, we wouldn't be married right now, because I know that she wouldn't have wanted to be married to an unbeliever. And I didn't really understand that whole concept as much until after I became a believer, but went to one of the church services, and as it turned out, it was a communion service, and being a Catholic, I was all nervous, willy-nilly about that. Yes, before you go to receive the communion, you're supposed to go to confession, you're supposed to do this, and say, all the Our Fathers and Hail Marys and all the things that the priest tells you, and obviously I hadn't done any of those things. The pastor said that the communion was an open communion, and anyone that was in the service, if they felt led by the Holy Spirit and God, they should come up and take part. And I was getting more and more and more nervous. And I think a lot of what brought me up to that communion table was the message that I heard from that pastor that day, and it was from Ephesians, laying down your sword, putting on the full armor of God. That whole story, and as it turned out, the pastor was walking around the pulpit wielding one of these big swords, so. That was interesting to me anyway, but so I was very engaged in the service. Came time for communion, and I was very nervous prior to, and all of a sudden I just stood up and walked up there, and when I got to the communion table, I realized what I had been doing, which was not living my life for God. And I was overcome with emotion at the time. I was sad and happy and all of those things, but sad that I'd been a sinner and that I hadn't figured it out until such a late time in my life. But then happy that now I've found the Lord that we all should be believing in. So I received my communion, and after that, kind of did a whole real fast track. When I did that, that was a little over 12 years ago. So I was older. I was in my 50s, and of course started attending service. I was baptized within a couple months, and went to small group studies, all kinds of different things. I just really jumped in, and since that time, my faith has grown in a big way since that time, and I'm just blessed knowing that I finally found God.
Okay, what are some big ways that your life has changed since coming to know Christ?
Well, I realized that, for one, all of those things that were my God before, my job, my son, all the activities that I did, those were my gods. And as much as, you have a past life and then you have a life after you accept Christ, those all are still very important to me, but I realized that they weren't what my life should be about. So, like I said, I immersed myself in the Word. That woman that introduced me to the church, and I got married. And since that time, we've done a whole lot of I've had a whole lot of spiritual growth since that time, and we've done a whole lot of ministering together as a couple since that time. Work with our youth group. We serve in capacity on worship teams. We've gone on mission trips, and for the last 5 years, I've been an elder in the church. So I have jumped in with both feet, and what I realize is that I was trying to make up for lost time, I think, and that really wasn't necessary, because what's important is where my faith is now, and what I believe, and how I use that faith with the different ministries that we do to further the kingdom. So yeah, I live for Christ. He's the most important thing in my life. He's the most important thing in my wife and my life. It's been amazing transformation for me.
Have you seen your relationship with Christ change any of the relationships with your family?
Oh yeah. There's friends, family. I mean, it wasn't like I was this really bad guy or anything, but some of the relationships that I had with friends changed. I was different. They noticed I was different. They were the same, couldn't figure out what was going on with me. And it took me a while to balance all that out, because I think when you're first on fire for the Lord, you want to tell everybody about it. And I probably did, and that's what kind of maybe a little too much too soon. And that probably went with friends and family. I've since become a more mature Christian. Unfortunately, some of the friends that I used to have, I no longer have because of my walk and where they're at. one of the biggest things is my relationship with my son, who's a non-believer, and it has gotten better in the last few years. But I think when I first became a believer, it was a little bit too much for him because it came shortly after a divorce. Even though he was an adult, there was a lot of changes that he saw with his father, and a lot of that was unsettling to him, and there was a real stepping back. That's gotten better. He's not a believer, and I'm a bigger believer, but I just know when to keep my mouth shut, and when I can talk about the Lord. So that's those are some lessons in life that I had to learn as I became a stronger believer as well.
Are your parents still living, John?
No.
Okay. Were either of them at the time you got saved?
No, they were both gone.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I think my mom was a believer. And I know there's a lot of Catholics that are real strong Christians. There are some Catholics that are not that way, but she did believe. And I remember when she passed, she was praying, and I was sitting at her deathbed. She died from cancer, and I walked through that for 3 months when she was dying. But I think that had a profound impact on me as well. I didn't realize it at the time, but I realize now what a strong woman of God she was. And so there are things that I've there's regrets. I wish I would have become a believer before the age of 53. But I think that everyone's story is different, and how we live our life now is more important than what we did before, because there was darkness before and now there's light, and that's what I feel. And so now I'm walking in the light.
Good. All right. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we close?
Maybe a word to anyone that is watching this. If you have not committed your life to Christ, if you've not repented, if you've not decided that Jesus Christ is the most important thing, obviously you're thinking about it if you're watching this video. Don't hesitate. I'm sure you have friends. I'm sure there are family members. There are people that can help you, and open the Bible, get in the Word, read the book of John. I've read it. I've read that book that was the first book I read when I became a Christian, and I've just finished reading it again, and I think I've read that full book maybe a half a dozen times, and each time I read it, it gets better and better. So I suggest that. So.
Great.
All right.
Thank you for sharing